There's like these two modes here. These two modes that I keep talking about come in. There's the organic mode, which unfortunately for the past several generations has actually been less and less. But you can imagine the organic mode, you and I probably quite can, of actually living the exploration of your environment. And so you get on your bike and you ride around your neighborhood, or back in the earlier days, you would just walk. And you begin to learn the features of the terrain and notice that the pond in this period of time is big, and the pond in this period of time is small, and this period of time is there's fish, and this period of time there's turtles, and when the wind changes, like you get to notice the extremely high dimensional signaling structure that is the interface layer between your perception and your agency in the context of the hyperobject that is your milieu. Of course, these days we end up with a fork, which unfortunately happens like around 1, where we actually don't even enter into the complex milieu. We actually only stay in a complicated object-defined milieu of like iPads and cars and schools, and scarcely ever touch the complex environment, which means that we're hyper, and I'll use that term ironically, maladapted to the actual complexity which we've always been in, right? To the degree to which we give our agency into these complicated machineries that are not even meaningfully of our actual design anymore, which separate us from the complexity of the world, we are radically disempowering ourselves. Right? So that's that piece of the story.
Right.
But to the degree to which we have a sense of a certain scope of hyperobject that we naturally have learned how to be in some real hyper agency with, to what degree can we use this modality of naturalness, of hyper agency, to achieve a responsibility or a responsiveness to this much larger scope, the world, the whole world?
I mean, of course, Kurtz's famous line is the horror, right? Again, about this. And aesthetics doesn't mean like the prettiness of objects. He means the fundamental way in which you have disposed your sensibility, your mode, the kind of mode you're talking about.
Yeah.
And then Jonathan Wright talks about sensibility transcendence. And sensibility transcendence, it's based on a famous example from Iris Murdoch in The Sovereignty of the Good, where Murdoch is talking about the attentional core of morality and are paying attention to things in the right way, like giving them their due regard is actually the core of all of morality.
Yeah.
Now Wright calls that sensibility transcendence, which is this idea. Sensibility transcendence is not up and away. It's no. I'm going to allow my cognition to be tailored and fitted to you in your moreness and your suchness, which is not the same thing as rising up through the taxonomy or rising up through spatial temporal context. It's like, no. And this is like Collingwood's idea of art, right? What art's primary function, according to Collingwood, is to remind us that things are not their categorical identities, which is right? And that's what sensibility transcendence is to have that insight, like to really remember that, that there, right, transcends my categories. And I need to therefore also transcend my categories for myself in order to come into right relationship, right? So that's sensibility transcendence. And he thinks that the aesthetic experience that points to that is horror. Marlowe is cultivating something where he can come into the right relationship of that which is horrifying without becoming what horror can do to people. Like, what's the sensibility transcendence that acknowledges the intimacy of the horror, but also remains in relationship? And what came to my mind then is Otto's notion of the numinous, because the numinous is simultaneously horrifying and fascinating. We are bound into it, and we are going to sensibility transcendence. That's what fascination literally means, right? And the horror, right? And the horror and the fascination are actually two facets of a deeper thing, which is the mystery of the thing. The fact that, right, our attempts to categorize it fail, right? But we are drawn into it nevertheless. And if you remember, hyperobjects persistently fall between the cracks of our bespoke and beloved categorical distinction, right? And so the aesthetic of horror, I think what he most properly should be offering is the aesthetic of the numinous.
Well, I'm gonna go even further. I would say a practicum of the numinous.
Ah, yes,
Right.
yes,
If you want to move and deal with things that are in hyperobject space, you've got to go through that decompression chamber and learn a new mode, right? A whole new mode of agency. Like once you go through that decompression chamber, you're discovering this new form of sovereignty that is grounded in this hyperobject space and is appropriate and responsive to the hyperobjects. There's a whole series of practicum associated with the numinous. And in that practicum of the numinous is also beautifully the emergence of an entirely novel form of collaboration.
right, yes.
There are distinct forms, so I'm just going to use the you metaphor. So the distinct forms of what I'll say distributed cognition on either side of the you.
Right.
All right.
Yep.
On this side of the you, which is to say in category space, in object space, distributed cognition takes the form of, I'm going to call it coordination.
Yep.
And on the other side of the you, right? So we come to the bottom, we're coming back up, and we're learning how now to play together again as a distributed cognition, but now in this new numinous practicum.
Yes.
This is what I've been calling coherence.
Right.
So
Oh,
coherence.
this is very helpful, Jordan.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
I thought it might be.
Yeah.
Coherence is the name that I use to describe what distributed cognition looks like on the other side of the you.
Right.
Or looks like and is. And it's different, right? There's a whole different sensibility to it. Now, of course, we experience it all the time. If we are dancing the tango with a partner, we're definitely not engaging in coordination and very little discussion and negotiation and transaction. More like a discovery of the high dimensional fluidity that is naturally available to humans in a natural context.
Right.
We can also do, by the way, coherence with a tree. This is what the stories of every artist is, that they feel some kind of relationship with the affordances of the possibility of that complexity. So when we dive back into complexity on the other side of the you, we're actually just diving back into complexity. This opens up all the other words, right? The horror now shifts to joy as we realize that this always was our natural state. And as we become more and more competent, as we become more and more artful of navigating more and more of complex reality in its own terms, then all kinds of things. This is where meaningfulness comes from. The other side of the you is the ground of meaningfulness.
Right. That's great. Of course, you've talked to me many times before about coherence, and I've gotten different, but that was a new facet of it. I mean, coherence is itself a hyperobject. Right. That was very helpful. You were specifying some dimensions of the practicum. One is the meditation, the mindfulness, dropping below the categorical space, if I can put it that way, the object space. But you also need the contemplative practice that exposes you to the hyperobjects, right, and beyond, that transcend because they break through the cracks or they're more encompassing than the object space. Each needs the other because each counterbalances and corrects the mistakes of the other. If I just contemplate without having done the meditation, I'm going to project like crazy. I'm going to project and misrepresent, right? But if I don't do this, then I won't properly do sensibility transcendence, right? And so the two are constantly checks and balance. And then there's a practicum, which is a practicum of being in distributed cognition that is constantly, continually in contact with both of those poles in a dynamic coupling. And that's what I call dialogos. That's what I mean by dialogos. Dialogos is not about object exchange communication. Dialogos is, can we get distributed cognition so that people are, and you're doing this in these practices, you're reaching in, which if that's even the right metaphor, with mindfulness, you're reaching out with contemplation, and then you're trying to do the dynamical coupling that is at the core. You're trying to, in Eckhart's, you're trying to give birth, make space for the logos, for something numinous beyond everybody that is a member of the distributed cognition. So I would say there's sort of the three dimensionalities at least to the practicum.
Yeah. Another word that I would just throw in there was Nietzsche's term levity. To just oppose it to gravity.
Oh, right, yes.
Right? To become a dancer, to become one that can fly, like this mode of agency that happens when you're moving. Dialogos, if you properly construe it, isn't just docking, right? Dialogos is carving, it's building, it's writing software, right? It's a mode of relationality with outside, or a mode of relationality, full stop, mode of relationality that has a particular disposition, a different quality to it. And so Nietzsche termed that levity, which I thought was a nice term to throw into the mix. Yeah. And so there's a whole bunch of stuff, right? Things that begin to show up, and many of them become quite simple. And when you're holding that dual mode of meditation and contemplation, there's also always a curiosity and orientation towards what's going to emerge. Yeah, I wonder what's going to happen next. That's interesting.
Wonder,
right? You're no longer you're like planning. You're not trying to make a point. You're actually curious about what will emerge in this space that has now been opened up, right? The space of possibility is now rendered available. You also have an orientation towards your interior. Like you're always noticing how your interior is a constantly shifting, complex milieu of itself.
The self, or perhaps an older term, the psyche, is a hyperobject. It's a hyperobject to your working memory, to your current state of consciousness. And this is ancient. Heraclitus said, you can't find the bounds of the psyche because its logos always transcends itself, or its logos is unlimited, right? And so, and this is one of Carmen's points. We have to realize, we have to give up the Cartesian sense that we fully grasp ourselves. We also withdraw from ourselves. There's also a moreness and suchness to us about our psyche. And so he actually says that one of the things we can think about how this goes with my notion of participatory knowing, and this amplifies what you said, by really tuning into the way I exceed myself, right? The way the logos, the psyche has a logos that transcends itself. I can fully participate and appreciate how everything also withdraws to itself and is beyond itself. And it's not a thought anymore. It's something that I'm enacting. And, and Morton talks about, when you're reaching for the cup, you're personifying the cup, but at the same time, you're allowing the cup to cupify you, right? And that sort of notion there, attuning outward, it is a constitutive thing you have to do, or you're really not coming into the right relationship.
Yes, in some sense, like the phrase that comes up is something like, until you have learned fully what it means to have unconditional love for and with and from yourself, it is in fact both impossible and, how do you say it, like inconceivable that you can do this with someone else and from someone else. And so you will misconstrue other people and you will misproject onto other people because you haven't yet been able to hold it just in your own self, which, as you said, the boundary of psyche is infinite. Yes. So even just within your own self, if one learns how to do that with oneself, one is doing it now in relationship with something that is unbounded. And that's the point. Now you have right relationship with the unbounded. And that's that disposition, like the dispositions of things like, well, love is sort of the core word, right? Yeah. Unconditional, to make space for emergent possibility with curiosity, right? Things like that. Like those are things that begin to show up as part of the practicum of the numinous. There's a whole complex of what we call psychotechnologies, right? And there are answers to this question that are relevant in the context of a single individual. So yes, it is possible as a single individual to achieve that level of sort of stability on the other side of the U. I can't, but I've heard that others maybe can. We certainly notice we have names for those kinds of people, saints and enlightened ones.
Yep.
However, this is a good news. It appears to be the case that although there is a sort of an additional challenge or an injection of additional complexity when you bring new people into the hyper conversation, there also is a shift in that set of psychotechnologies that how we help each other do that, right? And it turns out, so far as I can tell, that it is in fact, in some sense, let's say, easier to achieve stability of this sort in the context of a sangha
Yes.
than it is to do so in the context of a Buddha.
Yeah, that's what cognitive science is moving towards.
Mm.
That we are much more likely to achieve better problem solving in distributed cognition than we do in individual cognition. Not only because of sort of just sheer increase of computational power, but also because of the fact that if we frame it right, and we can misframe it, we can go, no, homogeneity, groupthink, no, adversarial processing. But if we find the middle path between those, we can get opponent processing, where your egocentrism and my egocentrism, you can use my egocentrism to transcend yours, and I can use your egocentrism to transcend mine. And this is why I think dialogos is so important, because it is the way of trying to say, exactly what you said. It encourages us. It gives us hope that we don't have to individually become the Buddha, because the Sangha has a potential that doesn't require us to be Buddhas, to nevertheless itself be a Buddha.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. And some very simple reasons why this is the case. Things like, statistically, it's extremely unlikely that my legacy triggers and your legacy triggers are the same.
Yes.
So what that means now is that we have a portfolio of coherence, meaning that if something comes along that sort of randomly triggers me, I may drop out of coherence, but you don't.
Right.
So now you're in a place where you can actually come from a place of coherence and help me find a context that brings me back into coherence, which might be a simple thing. It's like, I noticed that swimming in the ocean is a great way for you to get grounded again. I noticed, so there's like, we've developed whole protocols, like, shit, when I'm, totally going in this direction, here's like 4 or 5 things that are kind of likely things to just to recommend or remind that I'll probably have lost track of because I'm no longer sovereign. And just being able to provide those, like I'm doing very analytically, radically increases the probability of me doing them. And we've identified them as radically increasing the probability of me finding my way back into sovereignty. Cool. Like, there's a lot of basic things.
If you're willing to bind your identity to the person.
If you're willing to actually enter into that contract. Yep. If that's an agreement, if that's a mutual agreement, and it has to be a mutual agreement, and it can't look like this. Like, this is from in object space, relationships look like that.
Yeah.
That's a binding in object space.
Yep.
In hyperobject space, relationships look like that.
Yes, very much. Continuity of contact rather than closure of control. Yes, very much. Yeah.
Which has its own challenges and risks, right? Everything's got its own stories.
But it also has its own beauty.
Of course, yeah.
Not properly captured. This is the classic Platonic model, right? If we have what we can do is we can increase plausibility. Your biases and my biases, your triggers and my triggers, right? So plausibility is when I have many independent lines, and so what we come to is not due to the bias or the idiosyncratic triggers of each independent entity. I increase trustworthiness, but I also now get the possibility of elegance. I get the possibility of emergence, because you and I can afford each other's self-transcendence. So what we get is a circumambulation that generates plausibility, to use a sort of Platonic metaphor, right? We have a bunch of people around the topic, right? And we converge on it in a trustworthy fashion, and then it broadcasts back to us like global broadcast. It's emergence, elegance, new ideas, new insights that we all can share in. So it's not only that we give each other, affordances around triggers, we also give each other insights that take us beyond where we were.
All right, now let's throw in religion.
Okay.
All right.